You've reached Blessed Man Meditations, where we provide answers for the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. This is your first time on Blessed Man Meditations. You are catching us in the middle of a series where we answer skeptics' allegations about supposed Bible contradictions. There is a list of 101 that was submitted by Muslim scholar Shabbir Ally. And in this video, we are doing numbers 66 through 78. In previous videos, we did an introduction and contradictions 1 through 65. Number 66 begins by asking, did Herod want to kill John the Baptist, or did Herodias want to kill John the Baptist? In Mark 14:5, it appears to intimate that Herod wanted to have John the Baptist put to death, because Herod was a people pleaser, and the people thought that John the Baptist was a prophet. And in Mark 6:20, it says that, this is a passage that doesn't appear to talk about Herodias. So I wonder if the people who wrote these contradictions did not provide the right reference there, but that's okay. The supposed contradiction pointed out by Shabbir Ally is, did Herod want to kill John the Baptist? The passages used by Shabbir to promote his conjecture are Matthew 14:5, where it appears to say that Herod did want to have him killed, and 6:20. Oh, and Mark 6:20, where it says that Herod, where it appears to say that Herod was afraid of John and therefore didn't want to have him killed, or wanted to protect him. Maybe that's not a mistake that passage was used, because one says he wanted to put him to death, and another one says he wanted to protect him. Okay. However, the passages are complementary. When we look at the whole story, we see that Matthew 14:11 and Mark 6:14-29 don't contradict each other. This seems to be a similarly weak attempt by Shabbir to find a contradiction within the Bible, and he did a similar thing in the 50th contradiction that we covered in the previous video. In both passages, Herod has John imprisoned because of his wife Herodias. Therefore, it is the underlying influence of Herodias on Herod that is important to factor in John's beheading. He wanted to please his wife. Mark's account is more detailed than Matthew's, whose gospel is thought to have been written later, because Matthew does not want to waste time trampling old ground when it's already contained within Mark's gospel. Notice also that Mark does not anywhere state that Herod did not want to kill John, but does say that Herod was afraid of him because of John's righteousness and holiness, and, as Matthew adds, the factor of John's influence over the people. Number 67. Was the 10th disciple of Jesus in the list of 12 Thaddaeus, like it seems to say in Matthew chapter 10 and Mark chapter 3, or was it Judas, son of James, like it seems to say in Luke chapter 6? Come up with this contradiction when we misunderstand the historical context. In Matthew chapter 10, it says that, there's Thaddaeus at the end of verse 3, Lebbeus, whose surname was Thaddaeus. In Mark chapter 3, at the end of near the end of verse 18, and the next to last name in verse 18, it says that it was Thaddaeus. And in Luke, it says, Judas, son of James, is how it begins, verse 16, the last verse of that passage. Both can be correct. It was not unusual for people of this time to use more than one name. Simon or Cephas was also called Peter. Saul was called Paul. In neither case is there a suggestion that either was used exclusively before changing to the other. Their two names were interchangeable. There are other examples of interchangeable names in Scripture. Abram and Abraham. That was the same name. Of course, Abraham was given as a result of a promise, but it refers to the same person. Was the man Jesus saw, number 68, was the man Jesus saw sitting at the tax collector's office, whom he called to be his disciple, named Matthew, or was it Levi? Matthew seems to say Levi. Matthew seems to say Matthew. Mark and Luke seem to say Levi. As Jesus passed from there in Matthew 9:9, it says he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office and said to him, "Follow me." Mark chapter 2, it says Levi, son of Alphaeus. Luke 5:27 says Levi. Okay. The answer to this question is exactly the same as the previous one in that both scriptures are correct. Matthew was also called Levi, as the scriptures here attest. It is somewhat amusing to hear Ali, who submitted this list of contradictions, drawing so much attention to a legitimate custom, which was to have multiple names for the same person. In the run-up to a debate in Birmingham, England in February of 1998, Ali felt free to masquerade under an alternative name, Abdul Abu Safiya, meaning Abdul, the father of Safiya, his daughter's name, in order to gain an unfair advantage over Mr. Smith, his opponent. By disguising his identity, he denied Mr. Smith the preparation to which he was entitled. Now, here he finds it a contradiction when persons in the first century in Palestine either use one or the other of their names, a practice which is neither illegal nor duplicitous. There are perfectly legitimate reasons for using an alternative name. However, in light of Mr. Ali's unfair and deceitful practice that was just described, there is a ring of hypocrisy to these last two questions raised by him. Number 69. Was Jesus crucified on the daytime after the Passover meal, like it seems to say in Mark chapter 14, or the daytime before the Passover, like it seems to say in John chapter 13? In Mark chapter 14, it appears to say that he's going to go prepare the Passover. And in John chapter 13, before the Passover, he saw that his time coming. Yeah, and then the passages near the end of John chapter 13, you see the arrangement made with Judas. And in John chapter 18, you have, after Jesus has been arrested, it's early morning, and this is after Jesus has been whipped. Pilate says, "Behold your king." That Jesus was crucified on the daytime before the Passover meal. The reason why Mark seems to say it was after is one of culture and contextualizing. The evidence from the Gospels that Jesus died on the eve of the Passover, when the Passover meal would have been eaten after sunset, is very solid. Before we delve, albeit briefly, into this issue, it's worth noting that Mark 14 records that Jesus does not eat the Passover with his disciples. Luke chapter 14, verse 12 says it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is also called Passover. As the name suggests, part of the Passover meal was to eat bread without yeast. It is a commandment which Jewish people keep even today for the meal, for God makes it extremely clear to eat bread without yeast, and whoever eats bread with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. That was from Exodus chapter 12 when they celebrated the first Passover. The Greek word for unleavened bread is azimos. This is the word used by Mark in the Feast of Unleavened Bread in chapter 14, verse 12 of Mark. The Greek word for normal bread with yeast is artos. All gospel writers, including Mark, agree that in this last meal with his disciples, the bread they ate was artos, in other words, bread with yeast. While they were eating, Jesus took artos, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to his disciples, and said, "Take it, this is my body," in Mark 14, verse 22. Excuse me. It's highly probable, therefore, that this meal was not a Passover meal. The use of the different words in the same passage strongly suggests that this was not a Passover meal. For it would be unthinkable to them to eat something that God had commanded them not to eat, bread with yeast, artos, and to not eat something that they were commanded to eat, unleavened bread, azimos. Therefore, as this is true, what does Mark mean in verses 12 to 17? Firstly, we read, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb. Exodus 20, verses 1 through 8 says it must happen on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. However, there was dispute as to when this day was due to the debate on separate calendars, which were used for calculating feast days. It's possible that separate traditions were in vogue in Jesus' life. So indeed, it may have been customary to sacrifice the lamb on that day for some, although many, probably most, recognized the Passover as being the next evening. Secondly, the disciples asked Jesus, "Where do you want us to go to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" The disciples had no idea that Jesus was going to live his life going to give his life for the sins of the world, like the Passover lamb of Exodus 20 did to save the Israelites from God's wrath upon Egypt. Jesus had explained to them, but they did not grasp it for many reasons, including the healing of Jesus by the people as Messiah in the trial, or the hailing rather of Jesus by the people as Messiah in the triumphal entry, which was still fresh in their minds, ringing in their ears. He does not state that he would eat it with them. He wanted to, but he knew he would not. There's no room for any dogmatic statement that the Passover must be eaten on the same day the room was hired or prepared. Indeed, Jewish people, because of Exodus 12, thoroughly prepared their houses for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Thirdly, in some ways, the Gospels couch the Last Supper in terms of fulfillment. Luke chapter 22 records Jesus saying that he longed to eat this Passover meal with them. So does Luke say it was the Passover meal? It is doubtful, due to the same use of artos and azimos, among other reasons. Jesus did make this Last Supper a sort of Passover meal, but not the real one. He wanted to have this special fellowship with his disciples, his friends, being painfully aware of the agony he would go through only a few hours later. He also wanted to show his disciples that the Passover spoke of him, that he was the sacrifice that would bring in the new covenant God promised, just like the lambs that were killed 1,500 years earlier to save the people of Israel from God's wrath. He illustrated through the meal that he is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, just like John the Baptist said in John 1:29. He wanted to eat it with them, for he says, "I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." His coming death was its fulfillment, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed, like it says in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7. If this understanding is correct, one of two feasible explanations I opted for due to my current research, then there is no contradiction. Jesus died before the Passover meal. Number 70. Did Jesus both pray, like it says in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, or not pray, like it says in John 12, to the Father to prevent crucifixion? In Matthew 26, it says, there's Jesus praying, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Mark 14:36. Same thing. "Take this cup, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but you will." Luke 22. "Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me. Not my will, but your will." John 12:27. "My soul's troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour." The apparent contradiction asks, did Jesus pray to prevent his crucifixion? Mark 14:36 and Luke 24:22 are supposed to imply that he does ask the Father to prevent crucifixion. John 12:27, however, seems to say that he does not ask the Father to prevent crucifixion. This is a rather weak attempt at a contradiction, and again wholly relies upon the ignorance of the reader for its strength. Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22 are all parallel passages which take place in the Garden of Gethsemane just before Jesus gets arrested. In all these passages, Jesus never asks for the crucifixion to be prevented, but does express his fear of the difficulties, pain, and suffering that he's about to encounter over the next few hours when he has his trials, when he has his beatings, his whippings, his loneliness, and alienation from the people and from God on the cross, the ordeal of crucifixion itself, and the upcoming triumph over Satan. All of that is stuff that understandably would have brought him trepidation, not sinful trepidation. He does, however, more importantly, ask for God's will to be carried out over the next few hours, knowing that this is the means by which he will die and rise again, and by doing so atone for all the sins of the world. John chapter 12, verse 27 is from a totally different situation, one which takes place before the circumstances that were just described. It is said that while Jesus is speaking to a crowd of people during the Passover festival at the temple in Jerusalem, in fact, even before the gathering of the 12 with Jesus in the upper room, On this occasion, Jesus again says something very similar to the other passages above. Now my heart is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Again, we're reminded that he's feeling troubled. Again, we're reminded, I put that in there twice. So we're reminded that he's, in addition to being fully God, he's also fully human, that he was tempted in every point, like we are, yet without sin, unlike us, who are full of sin. Yet this statement is said to in reply to some Greeks who just asked something of Jesus through his disciples. It is really conceivable that this isn't really conceivable that this man wants to prevent the crucifixion from taking place? No way. Because he knew that he had to give himself as an offering for mankind so that they could be reconciled to God. Because he loves us. He loves his Father and he loves us. He loves his Father, he's one with the Father, and he loves us. Did Jesus move away 3 times or once from his disciples to pray? Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14 seems to say 3 times. Luke chapter 22 seems to say once. So let's see. Okay, verse 36, he says, sit here and I'll go pray. Verse 39 seems to say he went away again, came back to them and went away again, maybe. Verse 40, he comes back, finds them again. Okay, no, verse 42 is the second time he went away. And verse 44 is the third time he went away, it appears to say, just in scanning through those verses. In Mark, sit here while I pray, verse 32. Verse 35, he went a little farther. Verse 39, again, he went and prayed and came back. In verse 41, he came to them the third time. Okay, Luke 22. He was withdrawn from them in verse 41. Okay, this passage in Luke doesn't, it appears to only mention going away once. Okay. Shabbir asked how many times Jesus left the disciples to pray alone at the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of his arrest. Matthew 26 and Mark 14 show 3, but Luke 22 only speaks of 1. However, once again, there's no contradiction when you realize the 3 passages are complementary. Note that the Luke passage nowhere states that Jesus did not leave the disciples 3 times to go and pray. Because he does not mention all 3 times, this does not imply that Jesus did not do so. Obviously, Luke did not consider the fact to be relevant to his account. We must remember that Luke's gospel is thought of as the 3rd gospel to have been put to paper chronologically. Therefore, it would make sense for him not to regulate information found in the other 2 gospels. Number 72. When Jesus went away to pray, were the words in his 2 prayers the same, or were they different? Mark 14, verse 39 appears to say they were the same. Matthew 26, verse 42 appears to say they were different. Mark 14:39 says he spoke the same words. Matthew 26:42 appears to intimate that he said different words. This apparent contradiction, comparing Matthew 26 and Mark 14 in particular verses, is not a contradiction. Shabbir asked the question, what were the words of the second prayer at the Garden of Gethsemane? It relies heavily, once again, upon the reader of Shabbir's book being ignorant of the text mentioned, and his wording of the supposed contradiction is contrived and misleading. It relies heavily. Okay, let's see what Mark does say of the second prayer in 14:39. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. Nowhere in this verse does Mark say that Jesus prayed the same words as the previous prayer, but what he does imply by the words used in the sentence is that the gist of the prayer is the same as before, as the passage in Matthew shows. When we compare the first 2 prayers in Matthew, we see that they're essentially the same prayer, though not exactly the same wording. Then in verse 44, Matthew says Christ prayed yet again, saying the same thing. Yet according to Shabbir's thinking, the 2 prayers were different. So how could Jesus then be saying the same thing the 3rd time? It seems Shabbir is simply imposing a Muslim formula of prayer on the passages, which he simply can't do. You would expect this to be the case if this were originally formulated prayer that had to be repeated daily, as we find in Islam. But these prayers were prayers of the heart that were spoken by Jesus because of the enormity of the situation before him. Ultimately, that situation was secondary to the gravity, power, and loving bond that Jesus had with his Father. Number 73. Did the centurion say Jesus was innocent or that he was the Son of God? In Luke 23:47, he seems to say that Jesus was innocent when he says he was a righteous man. In Mark 15, it says that he was the Son of God. Okay, the question being forwarded is what the centurion at the cross said when Jesus died. The two passages quoted are Mark 15:39 and Luke 23:47. However, as has been said before with other apparent contradictions, these passages are not contradictory but are complementary. Matthew 27 and Mark 15 agree that the centurion exclaimed that Jesus was the Son of God. Luke 23:47, however, mentions that the centurion refers to Jesus as a righteous man. Is it so hard to believe that the centurion could have said both things? Nowhere in any of the gospel narratives do the writers claim that that was all the centurion said. Therefore, let's not impose on the writers what we would have the centurion say. Matthew and Mark are more interested by the declaration of divinity used by the centurion, whereas Luke is interested in Jesus' humanity, one of the main themes of the gospel. Thus, he refers to the corresponding statement made by the centurion. Number 74. Did Jesus say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in Hebrew, like it says in Matthew 27:46, or did he say it in Aramaic, like it says in Mark 15:34? Okay, so there's so Matthew 27:46 evidently is Hebrew, and Mark 15:34 appears to record it in Aramaic. The question of whether Jesus spoke Hebrew or Aramaic on the cross is answerable. However, the reason for Matthew and Mark recording it differently is probably due to the way the event was spoken of in Aramaic after it happened due to the recipients of the gospel. However, the whole issue is not a valid criticism of the Bible. Mark 15:34 is probably the most quoted Aramaism in the New Testament, being Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. However, it's doubtful that Jesus spoke in the language that Mark records them in. The reason is simple. The people hearing Jesus' words thought he was calling Elijah. It says so in those passages there quoted, that when they heard him talking, they thought he was asking Elijah to help them. In order for the onlookers to have made this mistake, Jesus would have to have cried, Eli, Eli, not Eloi, Eloi. Why? Because in Hebrew, Eli can either be my God or can be a shortened form of Elihu, which is Hebrew for Elijah. However, in Aramaic, Eloi can only be my God. It's also worth noting that lama, why, is the same word in both languages, and sabach is a verb which is found not only in Aramaic but also in Mishaic Hebrew. Why, therefore, is it recorded in Aramaic as well? Jesus was part of a multilingual society. He probably spoke in Greek, the common language of Greece and Rome, Aramaic, the common language of the ancient Near East, and Hebrew, the sacred tongue of Judaism, which had been revived in form of Mishaic Hebrew in Second Temple times. Hebrew and Aramaic are closely related Semitic languages. That Hebrew and Aramaic show up in the Gospels is therefore not at all surprising. That one gospel writer records it in Hebrew and another in extremely similar Aramaic is no problem to Christians, nor is it a criticism of the Bible. The simple reason for the difference is probably that when one of them remembered and discussed the happening of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, this phrase may well have been repeated in conversation as Aramaic, which would be perfectly normal, so he wrote it down as such. Mark may have written it in Aramaic due to the fact that he was the original recipient of the gospel. However, both of these reasons are simply speculation. If Mark recorded his words in Aramaic, then we would worry. Also, the fact that Jesus is God, even though he did, Philippians 2 says he voluntarily set aside some of his divine prerogatives, it is reasonable to surmise that he could have known both languages and spoken both languages when the need arose to do so. That's a possibility, since he's God. Since as God he has all knowledge when he needs to. So, lastly, verse number 75, were the last words that Jesus spoke, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," in Luke 23:46, or it is finished in John 19:30. There he says in Luke 23:46, "Into your hands, Father, I commit my spirit." Then he breathed his last. John 19:30, he received the sour wine, said it's finished, and bowed his head and gave up the spirit. What were the last words before Jesus died is the question asked by Shabbir that is supposed to be a contradiction. This does not show a contradiction any more than two witnesses to an accident in an intersection will come up with two different scenarios of that accident depending on where they stood. Neither witness would be incorrect as they describe the event from a different perspective. Luke was not a witness to the event and so is dependent on those who were. John was a witness to the event. What they are both relating, however, is that at the end Jesus gave himself up to death. It could be said that Luke used the last words that he felt were necessary for the gospel account, which concentrated on the humanity of Christ, noted in the earlier question, while John, as well as quoting the last words of Jesus, was interested in the fulfillment of the salvific message, and so quoted the last phrase, "It is finished." John 17:4 records Jesus' prayer to the Father in light of Christ's forthcoming crucifixion, stating that he had completed the work of revelation. And since revelation is a particular stress of the Gospel of John and the cross is the consummation of that commission, it is natural that his Gospel should center on Telestai. At any rate, if Jesus had said, "It is finished, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," or vice versa, it would be quite in order to record either clause of the sentence in his words. Luke Acts reaches its conclusion without any climax because of the continuing ministry of the exalted Christ through the Holy Spirit, and the church has no ending prior to the parousia, and to record Tetelestai may have undermined this emphasis, or it could have been taken the wrong way. At any rate, no contradictions involved, purely a distinction of emphasis. Number 76. Did the Capernaum centurion come personally to ask Jesus to heal his slave, like it says in Matthew 8:5, or did he send elders of the Jews and his friends, like it says in Luke 7? 8:5 says the centurion came to him. Luke 7 says he sent elders to the Jews. Not a contradiction, but a misunderstanding of sequence as well as a misunderstanding of the author's intent. The centurion initially delivered his message to Jesus via the elders of the Jews. It's also possible that he came personally after he had sent the elders. Matthew mentions the centurion because he was the one in need. Luke mentions the efforts of the Jewish elders because they were the ones who made initial contact. We know of other instances where the deed which a person tells others to do is actually done through him. A good example is the baptism done by the disciples of Jesus, yet it was said that Jesus did the baptizing. We can also understand why each author chose to relate it differently by understanding the reason they wrote the event. Matthew's main reason for relating the story is not the factual occurrence, but to relate the fact of the importance of all nations to Christ. This is why Matthew speaks of the centurion rather than the messengers of the crucifixion. It is also the reason why Matthew spends less time relating the actual story and more on the parable of the kingdom of heaven. Matthew wants to show that Jesus relates to all people. Luke, in his telling of the story, does not even relate the parable that Jesus told the people, but concentrates on telling the story in more detail, thereby concentrating more on the humanity of Jesus by listening to the messengers, the fact that he is impressed by the faith of the centurion, and the reason why he's so impressed. Because the centurion does not even consider himself worthy to come before Jesus. Ultimately, this leads to the compassion shown by Jesus in healing the centurion's servant without actually going to the home of the centurion. Number 77. Did Adam die the same day, or did he continue to live to the age of 930 after he sinned? It says in 2:17 of Genesis, when you eat of the tree in that day you'll die. In Genesis 5:5, says that he lived 930 years and died. Scriptures describe death in three ways. The first way is physical death, which ends our earthly life. The second way is spiritual death, which is separation from God. And the third way is eternal death in hell. The death spoken of in Genesis 2:17 is the second death mentioned above, that of complete separation from God, while the death mentioned in Genesis 5 is the first death, a physical death, which ends our present life. For obvious reasons, Shabbir Ally will see this as a contradiction because he does not understand the significance of spiritual death, which is a complete separation from God, since he will not admit that Adam had any relationship with God to begin with in the Garden of Eden. The spiritual separation and thus spiritual death is shown visibly in Genesis 3, where Adam was thrown out of the Garden of Eden and away from God's presence. Ironically, Adam being thrown out of the garden is also mentioned in the Quran in Surah 2, verse 36. Though there's no reason for this to happen if, as Muslims believe, Adam had been forgiven for his sin. Here is an example of the Quran borrowing a story from the earlier scriptures without understanding its meaning or significance, and therein lies the assumption behind the supposed contradiction. Number 78. Did God decide that the lifespan of humans was to be only 120 years or longer? 120 years in Genesis 6:3, or was it going to be longer like it says in Genesis 11? 120 years, Genesis 6:3. This is contrasted with the ages of the people who lived longer than 120 years in Genesis 11. Okay, however, this is based, I presume, on a misreading or misunderstanding of the text. 120 years spoken of by God in Genesis 6:3 cannot mean the lifespan of human beings, as you do find people older than that mentioned more or less straight away a few chapters on into the book of Genesis, including Noah himself. The more likely meaning is that the flood that God had warned Noah about doesn't happen until 120 years after the initial warning to Noah. This is brought out further in 1 Peter 3, verse 20, where it says, God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. Therefore, looking at the context of Genesis 3, it would agree with what we find in Genesis 11. That is the end of contradiction number 78 and the end of this video in this series. Next time we'll do contradictions 79 to 89. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.